Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Larkin. I am the founder and the CEO of Vitaccess. Thank you very much for joining us for the session this afternoon. This is our first digital real-world evidence live session at Vitaccess. So I'm going to guide you through the introduction. I'm going to introduce you to my colleagues, and then we'll get going. So that's what I look like, if you can't see my video as well. So I'll start by introducing the rest of the team here with me. So as you may know, we've got a session next week as well at the same time. And there I'll be joined by two colleagues, Casey Quinn, Helen Williams. But today I'm joined by Dr. Catherine Bottomley, Giles Monnickendam, and John Spinach, some of whom you can actually see here as well. And because this is about the real world, we thought we'd give you some little tidbits of us in the real world as well. So you can see our likes there, things that we like, but balance is important. So you can see our dislikes as well. There we are. So, and I don't know what yay yay music is yay either. So answers on a postcard. Okay, so that's our team. So I'm just going to give you pass over to a couple of my colleagues to introduce themselves. John, do you want to go first? This is passing over to John Spinach.
Yeah, sure. So am I live? Yeah. So I'm John Spinach. I'm Director of Technology at Vitaccess, based in Oxford in the UK. I've got about 20 years experience of software development in a number of regulated industries, including financial services, banking, insurance, pensions, and more recently the pharmaceutical industry. Also experience across multiple form factors, desktop, web, and mobile. So I lead product development of technology and software here at Vitaccess, and in particular for our digital real-world evidence platform. And as you can probably tell, I'm the one who looks least like their profile picture here, so I don't make an update.
The ravages of lockdown,
yeah.
etc. Thanks, John. Giles, over to you. Quick intro.
Hi there. Yes, I'm Giles Monnickendam. I'm the Director of HEOR at Vitaccess. I'm a health economics and market access specialist. I have got a long experience working in the life science industry, and then the last 5 or 6 years working in consultancy. And yeah, within Vitaccess, I am the HEOR head of the HEOR team and expertise within the company.
Thanks, Giles. And last but not least, Catherine, over to you. Quick intro.
Thank you, Mark. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you and to be with you this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Catherine Bottomley. I'm Director of Patient-Centered Outcomes here at Vitaccess. I've been with the company since the start of the year, and prior to that I spent 10 years working in patient-centered outcomes research, so both in pharmaceutical consulting and also in academia. Before that I started out life as a hospital pharmacist, so slightly different to what I'm doing now.
Thanks, Catherine. Okay, we're going to carry on then. So let me take you just through the agenda. So we're welcome, we're halfway through. I'm going to pass over shortly to Catherine, who will take you through overview and learning objectives for the various different sessions we've got for you. After that, we're going to come back, and the four of us are going to have a little chat about key success factors and toolkit. We recognise that actually perhaps not everyone's able to stay to the for the whole session, so we'll try and give a bit of a summary of what some of the themes that we're going to go through for the rest of today's session, but also the session next week as well. Then after that, we've got 3 complementary sessions. Catherine will take us through patient-centered outcomes in a real-world app-based setting. John will take us through inclusive design and engagement, and then to Giles about intelligent design, so anticipating HTA evidence requirements for effective study design. So these are 3 sort of standalone sessions, but they're complementary. As you'll see, doing a digital real-world evidence study involves all of those things, and so hopefully we can give you a good understanding of how to bring those together. And then we'll have a wrap up 10 minutes if we're on time towards the end. Okay, just a very quick introduction to our company, Vitaccess. For those of you who don't know us, We are a digital real-world evidence research and strategy scale-up. There's about 40 of us now. We were founded about 3 years ago. We used to be based in Oxford until about 9th of March when we closed our office, and we're now a 100% remote-first organisation, like many of, I'm sure you who are joining the call. So we do analytics, consulting, data, and localization. They're the sort of 4 teams that we have within our company. We've happily won some nice awards. In fact, we've just won, hot off the presses, it says here we're the EU Awards finalist. In fact, we won it at the Reuters Award this afternoon, so we're very pleased about that. So those are some awards. And look, this is what we do. We've developed a platform that enables us to do digital real-world evidence studies. Broadly, that platform is composed of 2 parts. It enables us to deploy secure smartphone apps, Android and iOS, to participants' smartphones. And the other part of the platform is what we call a research portal, which is composed of interactive dashboards that enable people researchers to explore the data and get insights from it in pretty much real time. We've done, on these, as you see on the left, various international projects, as you see there, across orphan diseases, oncology, now moving into chronic diseases as well. And I won't go into this too much, but actually the key part of these types of studies is their flexibility. So in our platform, we've got a modular architecture because the data capture for a long-term study in a pediatric indication might be completely different from the data capture in an elderly oncology study, for instance. Okay, that's very quickly on that. And you will touch upon many of these capabilities that are needed to make effective digital real-world evidence studies. We've listed those here, which we do in-house. I'm trying to give you a big sales pitch, but really there's a range of activities that's needed, from design of a study through to development and right through to implementation and getting the data out in publications and other benefits. So that's I'm doing quite well on time. Fantastic. So that's all we have by way of an introduction, and I'm going to take you pass over to Catherine, who will take us through some housekeeping and some learning objectives for the session. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Fantastic, thank you, Mark. So I'm just going to share my slides with you now. I'm hoping that you can see them. We think we'd be used to this after 6 months of working on these platforms, wouldn't you? Fantastic. So as Mark said, I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking to you about the content of our presentation today and the learning objectives that you will expect to get out of our various sessions that we have planned, and also go through a couple of informal bits of housekeeping too. So what's the overall aim of our session today? Well, we want to be able to illustrate to you how a collaborative co-creation process is the optimal way to run an international adaptive digital real-world study. As Mark's already explained, that's what we do day in, day out, and we've developed a process that we think is the best way to do things. It's certainly the approach that works very well for us in terms of data capture, data analysis, and we'd like to share some of that thinking with you. Essentially, what we'd like to do is to show you how we go from the blank sheet of paper, so the idea that our sponsors come to us with. Sometimes that idea is complex, it's well thought out. Sometimes it's just, I'd like to collect some data to show how patients are impacted by a particular disease. So we usually start right from scratch. And first of all, we're going to tell you about how we get from that blank sheet of paper to our signed off protocol. So what's the kind of thinking that goes on there? Who are the various people from our team who get involved? And what do we actually do on a day-to-day basis? You know, what do each of our roles involve? We're then going to take you, starting in this session and also going into our session that we have planned for next week. How do we get from the protocol, so the scientific basis for the study, into the development and launch of our data collection platform? So what's some of the thinking that goes on there? Who are the people involved? And again, what are the practical processes? And then in our session next week, we'll also talk to you about how we get from that data collection, having that data set, right through to how that data is presented. So we tend to do exactly as you would expect: interim analyses, final analyses. We churn out graphs, we churn out tables, etc., full of data. But we also do things that we think are quite different in terms of how our data is reported and visualized, and we'll be taking you through some of those. So the 3 sessions that we have planned for you today, so following a short discussion around the toolkit that you'll need to put together to do this type of study, I'll be taking you through the role of the patient-centered outcomes team. So that's the team that I lead here at Vitaccess. I'll be telling you a bit about how we get involved in the studies and what some of the unique challenges are that I've experienced in my role since I've started Vitaccess, and how they can be very different from applying patient measurement science in other settings. John will then take you through inclusive design and engagement. So he'll be starting to talk about how we get from that protocol to developing the data collection tool itself and some of the thinking and design work that goes on there. And then finally, Giles will be taking you through the HEOR perspective. So he'll be talking to you about how to anticipate HTA evidence requirements during that study design. So in terms of the learning objectives and things that you will expect us to cover today, we'd like you to go away from listening to my session understanding what's meant by patient-centered outcomes, if it's something that you're not familiar with already, and also what we mean when we say real-world app-based setting. What does that actually look like? How does it differ from typical data collection methods or other data collection methods that you might see? And also, what does that look like in our studies? What type of thing are we producing? How is it unique? How is it different? I'm also going to be outlining the differences between a patient registry and a registry-based study. It's a real sort of hot topic at the moment, something that's really topical within the industry, and I'll be taking you through some of those key differences when you're thinking about study design. I'd also like you to be able to understand the challenges of selecting and applying patient-reported outcome measures or COA instruments in an app-based setting. So what are some of the unique considerations there? And then I'd also like to take you through our approach. So what is it that we do? How do we come up with the list of questions that we're going to be asking the patients in the studies that we run? Following my session, I'll then hand over to John. So the learning objectives that John would like you to get out of his session include learning how to create solutions for one that extend to many. He'd like you to recognise who we're leaving out. So not only to be thinking about that question, but also recognising those particular patient groups. He's going to talk about creating persona spectrums and appreciating bias. He's going to also be talking about behavioural approach to accessibility. And then he's also going to touch on appreciation of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, WOO spectrum, which I'm looking forward to hearing a bit more about myself, and the hierarchy of rewards. After John's session, he'll then pass over to Giles, who's going to talk to us about anticipating HTA evidence requirements within the design of our studies. Specifically, he's going to cover how to understand the relevance of real-world evidence to health technology assessments. Is it relevant? If it is, how is it relevant? In what situations? He's also going to take you through understanding the scope for real-world evidence to impact on pricing and access decisions. And then also, keeping things a bit more personal to the work that we do, he's going to talk you through our approach to capturing the HTA perspective in study design and where him and his team come into the protocol development and all of the thinking and talking that we do with our sponsors during that design process. So that's what we're going to cover in session 1 today. Before we begin, I'll just take you through some very brief housekeeping. So you will have noticed already everyone's mics are on mute. Again, I mentioned at the start that you'd think we'd be used to using all of this technology. We all know that that's not always the case. So we have muted mics. If you would like to use the chat box to converse, ask questions, comment, agree or otherwise with what we're saying, please feel free. The other thing that you may have noticed so far is that we are fairly informal in our approach. We're formal where we need to be, where we have to be, but if we don't have to be, we like to be human, and that's absolutely fine for you to be too. So please feel free to go off and get a cup of coffee, see to your pets, see to your kids as you need to, drop in and out. There's no formalities here. And then finally, if you do have any questions that you'd like to ask, we're going to try and leave time for those as we go along. Depending on how the presentations go, we may need to come back to address some of those questions at the end, but please feel free to put them in the chat box, and we will be able to contact individuals after the talk as well if there's something that you would particularly like to be addressed. So please feel free to have discussions, etc. The chat box you will find on the right of your screens. I'm hoping that people are able to access it, and that we have some conversation going on there already. Great, so that's everything for the introduction. So I'd like to now hand back over to Mark just to take you through some of the introductions to a real-world evidence toolkit.
Thank you very much. Hopefully everyone can hear me and see me again. Now, as I said before, we were going to go into a lot more detail about these different sessions, but what we thought you might find useful is just to try and bring a summary of those together. So if Giles and John and Catherine would like to join me, I can take you through just a couple of slides which summarize those ideas. Now, I'm just showing my screen again. So, oops, a little bit of lag. So, on this slide, we've really tried to provide a summary from each of the three sessions that we're going to take you through. So what I thought I'd do is just hand over to each of the leaders of each of the sessions who will just give you those summaries. And what we've tried to do is put those into a number of key success factors. So the patient-centered outcomes for inclusive design, and then the intelligent design one with Giles. So Catherine, do you want to start off with your summary for the first part? Oh, you're muted, I think.
Yeah, it was always going to happen, wasn't it? What a classic. Okay, thanks very much, Mark. So I've had a think about some of the critical success factors that are a key to success when we're thinking about making sure that we're collecting the data that really matters to patients. And the work that I do as part of the patient-centered outcome strategy for the projects that we design and run. So the first critical success factor in terms of patient-centered outcomes is making sure that you collaborate both early and also effectively with patients to make sure that you can understand those issues. So collaborating early means collaborating as soon as you start to think about the design of that study. So before you've got your first draft protocol, before you jump into the literature to start thinking about what's out there already and what other people are doing, we collaborate with patients immediately. So it's one of the first activities that we do. And that's really, really important to us in understanding and collecting data directly from patients. We want them to be able to tell us what's important to measure, what's important to include. And actually engaging with them early and involving them in that process right from the start tends to, as you can imagine, go down very favorably. And actually that relationship, that continued relationship throughout the study is really, really important. So it's not only about an early relationship, but also about an effective relationship throughout that study process. And I'll be talking a bit more about what that relationship looks like in my session. Secondly, I've said my critical success factor is considering the patient-centered strategy for each project individually. So it depends on the data needs, the audience. So often our sponsors will tell us who needs to view the data, who's going to be considering it. And it's really important to note that one size does not fit all in terms of patient-centered outcome strategy. So we can't use the same instruments for each project. We can't think about things in the same way even. We need to come to the table with a blank sheet of paper for each project, and really to consider that group of patients as individuals. The other critical success factor that I've identified is balancing the measurement science needs with the user experience considerations. So again, that's something which I'm going to touch on a little bit more in my session, but it's something which we've identified as a potential challenge, and something that we encounter on a day-to-day basis. So how do we make sure that the data that we're collecting is reliable, it's valid, we're going about things in the right way in terms of the measurement science and all of the theory that underpins that, but also making sure that that is a positive experience for those users and those patients. And often it's about getting a balance between those things. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in my study, but in my session. But yes, particularly that balance is absolutely key.
Yeah, not just to add on to it a little bit of that, Catherine, I think what we've found in the different studies that we've carried out is that this type of digital study is relatively new, and we as scientists can get pretty excited about the possibilities. We can get very excited about trying to measure lots of things, do it really frequently, but there's a big danger in that if you overdo it, you overburden the patients, the participants, you get nothing, because they'll turn off. It won't be the value proposition, if you like, for them participating in the study won't be there. And if you do that, you get nothing. So we always encourage caution in that way. So better to have a bit less and get good data than to be over optimistic and potentially get nothing. And I guess back to the why this is about collaborative co-creation is that what is the right balance? Well, we don't know, and it varies by indication, but the best way of finding out what the sweet spot is engaging very, very early with patients, with advocacy groups, etc., who will help you, as Catherine said. And if you do that properly, they'll be very willing partners in that enterprise. Okay, thanks very much, Catherine. So I'll pass over to John, who's going to give us some key success factors for inclusive design and engagement.
Thanks, Mark. Yep. So in my session, I'm going to be looking a little bit more, as Catherine said earlier, about who are we leaving out of these studies. So we obviously, when we're thinking about recruitment and getting people to join and participate in the studies, we want to be able to include as many eligible people as possible. The work we do naturally is with people who may have special accessibility considerations. There's plenty of good work has gone on actually when it comes to inclusive design within what we call user experience design, and lots of names you would recognize, Microsoft, Google, etc., have done a lot of research in this area to date. So we're going to be borrowing some of the standards and some of the guidelines that have been thought through already and seeing how those translate into this kind of study application. And we can look at some of what the current best practices and standards are there, the types of things you would want to adhere to and be conforming with and recognize if you're designing a study of this type. There are some drawbacks to not recognizing those things, and I'll go through some of that in some detail in my session. But it's certainly, as a summary, it's true to say that it's not just because you would want to do the right thing. There are some rules and regulations in place to consider there. And then the final part, which is an area which actually is huge, and I'm not going to be able to do it justice in the time we've got, but if there's demand, we could maybe think of something another time. But it's all about engagement and how we engage with our participant cohort, both upfront in the initial stages and also longitudinally over time, in a way that keeps them really involved and interested and willing to take part on a regular basis. There's some specific considerations that we would want to think about when we talk about engagement methodology, and that you know, that depends a lot on the research that we can do with that user group, that participant group. And I'll talk about some ways that we can engage with participants to do that research. And funnily enough, you know, some of those things again are borrowed from other industries, such as the gaming industry for software development, for example. There's been some really good work done, both empirically, but more, you know, more sort of thorough scientific research. And we can borrow some of those and tailor those to again this type of environment.
Cool, thanks, John. And just perhaps to add one point to what you were mentioning, I mean, as we were saying, design is really important. And I think now there is the expectation amongst the general population that technology, apps, etc., do look slick, are easy to use. So if you have some data capture technology that is neither of those things, you might have problems. And it's also the case that we know that if we're using PRO instruments, by and large, there's very limited room to maneuver in terms of how those have been, how those are presented, because that's clearly been established and validated, etc. So things around the PRO can be quite important. You know, to put it in one extreme, if you've got a really badly designed interface, maybe they'll never get to see a PRO that you want to administer them to them. So it's really, really important. So thanks, John. Okay, and then I was going to pass over to Giles, a few key success factors about intelligent design.
Oh yeah, so my focus is really on the application of real-world evidence that's generated to the achievement of market access, and that's really thinking about both centralized health technology assessment agency or pricing and reimbursement decisions, and then also
might have a bit of a technical problem with Giles's sound.
You can't hear me? Is that not coming through?
I can hear you, Giles.
Okay, well, I'll continue, hoping that that I can be heard on stage. But yeah, that also, you know, that also includes regional and local payers and the choices that they make in more individualized decisions. And you know, really, what we try and start from, and what we believe is a key success factor in any real world evidence study is, you know, understanding from the very beginning, you know, what is the payer perspective on product value within the particular disease that you're aiming at. And you know, anticipating that in advance can help you understand where are the strengths and weaknesses in your evidence base, and where is the real opportunity for real world evidence to make a critical contribution. And you know, and once you've established that at a high level, you can then begin to determine what RWE study you need to plug the gaps. And you can look more carefully at the individual HTA preferences, you know, in your target markets to understand what particular instruments and analyses that you need to include within your study design in order to successfully meet the HTA requirements when you eventually come to the assessment process. You know, there is a, depending on the amount of resources that you have and the time that you have, you can adjust how thorough that exercise is. But certainly, it's definitely something to be recommended rather than finding that out after the event. Having completed a very expensive study and then finding that in fact, for a particular HTA that's high priority for you, their preference is an alternative instrument, and therefore your evidence is of very low value for them.
Great. Thanks very much, Giles. So that'll give you a bit of a taster of the different sessions that we're going to be going through in more detail. So I'll just put up another slide, which we call toolkits. Now, just let me explain this to you a little bit. In the studies that we've carried out, we tend to split them into 3 phases. a discovery phase where all the design activities are undertaken, a development phase where the protocol's been finalized, and then there's finalization of the data capture solution, however that's been configured, and then finally into implementation, which obviously is pretty straightforward. So what we tried to do here is list out some of the key work streams that need to be undertaken by phase of the study, and we're gonna talk about a range of those this week, but actually we'll revisit some of those next week, which we've put into blue. So for instance, our colleague Helen Williams leads our localization team. She's going to be taking you through the requirements for building international studies. Most of our studies are international, and there's big benefits for using digital tools to be able to roll out studies internationally. So Helen will talk about those activities next week. So you see a number of activities in blue and others in black. We're going to talk a little bit more about in the coming sessions. We've mentioned a few of these already, you know, multi-stakeholder input, for instance. You know, this whole workshop's about collaborative co-creation, so I guess that's not going to be too much of a surprise for you. You know, but it does take time. So we're, as you've already heard, we're big fans of this collaborative approach. It does take time, but we would say that the time spent on that collaboration is hugely valuable, and it's maybe a false economy, and it does take resources, of course, not just in time, but in financial resources. But we would say, in our experience, that it's a bit of a false economy to perhaps ignore some of those collaborative opportunities in favour of launching a study more quickly. When we look back to our experience, if we hadn't have done some of those activities, we would not have done the same studies, and they would certainly have been weaker. So we're big advocates of that. We'll touch a little bit on information governance. You know, many of you who experience these types of studies will know there's requirements in terms of GDPR, not just that, but a range of associated activities that need to be thought through very clearly, or put it another way, if you don't think through them clearly, you've got risks associated with that. The protocol is pretty straightforward, as we know. But however, the protocols for these types of studies may look a little bit different from the protocols you're familiar with. And literature HTA review, you'll be, I'm sure, familiar with those in other settings. For these types of studies, there's a lot of benefit to be had by reviewing the literature, seeing what has been developed, what has been measured in the indication you're looking for, if there are learnings that can be had from other comparable studies, for instance. And then, you know, Giles will also talk about this when he goes into his session, but payer research and scientific advice. You know, in other industries, if you're going to do something for a particular customer, it makes sense to talk to that customer as you're developing something for them. So here, if you're thinking about developing a digital study for you, and there are a range of other use cases, but if you're thinking about doing a digital study to generate data for health technology assessment agencies, it's probably sensible to talk to them about it before you eventually take the data set to them. In our experience, they're very receptive to that. And again, the investment in time, it is very clear. So we'd strongly encourage that. Moving into the development phase, there's some things to think about from a data protection perspective, data protection impact assessments. There's some of these things that your vendors cannot do for you as well. You'll need to do for them yourselves. However, a good vendor will be able to advise you on that. And even if your information governance colleagues haven't done a study like that, there are good frameworks that can be used, so it shouldn't be too daunting. But the key thing is to start these discussions early, particularly if in your organization you haven't done a study like this before, because that can slow down launch timings if you get behind on that. Next week, Casey will take us through statistical analysis plan and then data monitoring plan when we get into the implementation phase. But you know, just to say that these studies are flexible. That's one of the big advantages of doing a digital study. It's flexible. So if you have experience of doing a study where perhaps you've gone away and started it, and then a significant time later you get sight of the data and see that there are some problems, you know, we would say that can be avoided. So thinking about monitoring thinking about both, of course, formal interim final analyses, but also some sort of monitoring plan to see if it's going as well as it should do. If it's not, what action can you take to get it back on track? In addition, you know, Catherine's going to talk about the PCO strategy, but there's some nuts and bolts when you've made those decisions about getting those instruments licensed. They have certain timelines as well, which again are a little bit variable. So it's important that it's a shame if the PCO licensing timelines would be on your critical path and delay a launch. That's worth thinking about. And then finally, UAT, user acceptance testing. Broadly, as we've said, the mantra is talk to people early, get them on board, find out that the study you're going to do is well designed and well targeted. But we're in the development phase. There's very discrete, well-defined testing regimes that you should be following. Again, it does take time, but there's a significant risk if you don't do that. So user acceptance testing is one of those. And then finally, just to mention in implementation, we've found that governance frameworks for these types of studies are extremely important. So while different stakeholders such as key opinion leaders, patient advocacy groups are potentially very eager, willing and valuable partners, they will want the chances of them being such good partners is dictated in part by the transparency of the governance framework you have. So if you think about that very carefully, and if you set up, for instance, something like a scientific advisory board, which makes we would say follows best practice and is extremely valuable, particularly for a long-term study. If you do that, go as far as establishing a charter. Say what your expectations are for the different people involved in terms of, are they involved in the monitoring of the study? Are they involved in the publication planning? Are they involved in the data access framework for academic researchers, should you wish to offer that type of access? So the more that you think about that up front, the better the chances you have of getting those different stakeholders on board. Okay, so hopefully that makes some sense. I also, we've got a couple of minutes left, so I just wanted to show you a couple of examples actually. You may already be thinking this is a lot of work, this could be quite daunting, setting one of these digital adaptive studies up. And there is a lot of work to it, to do it properly. But I also want to just show you a couple of anonymized examples, because we think that the upside of doing one of these types of studies well is significant. And I was just going to show you that from some anonymized examples from some of the studies that we've run. First one is in terms of rapid recruitment. So this is a launch curve for a study we've been running recently. And one of the countries is Italy. And for rare disease, we got up to over 100 participants, recruited into the study from the launch event, you know, just in a space of about just a few days. So that's A, pretty exciting for us, B, pretty exciting for the other stakeholders involved in that study. You know, a lot of work goes into the lead time before you get to launch, but once you do get to launch, you can have very nice steep recruitment curves, which means that you're very much closer to getting insights out of the data and getting the data out quickly. So that's a recruitment curve. We'll talk a little bit about, and we've mentioned this a little bit already, about design and engaging with participants. It's a big subject, and it's one that should be thought about very carefully for all studies. How you engage with participants in a digital study depends on the indication, depends on the design of the study. But in our experience, at least, we're big fans of reward frameworks and gamification. This slide shows some data from one of our studies where actually we looked at the percentage of participants who did any study, any survey, which you see on the left, and we looked at the percentage of participants who did all of the surveys that we wanted them to do. and it was a quite intense study. And what we found is when there was no reward framework, we got some reasonable level of engagement, and of course, a lower percentage of people did all of the surveys, as you see in the line columns there. But actually, what we did with a separate arm of the study, in which we provided a reward framework, we had far bigger engagement. So we thought quite carefully about the reward framework with our patient partners, the patient advocacy group partners, and when we implemented that, we got really fantastic results, which we were delighted with. And then finally, what do you get out of the data? Why do you go into doing one of these studies? To get insights out of it, to understand better about a certain aspect you're interested in measuring. Now, these digital studies have very rich opportunities for publications, both in terms of the rapidity of getting the data out, because you can get the data out in real time, and then the richness of the data set you're building, which can be sliced and diced in different ways, reflecting different periods of time, different domains of data. So this is just a time course from one of the studies that we've done, which is quite a long-term study, showing back in 2018, we launched a study and we had some sequential launches across different countries. And then we had a whole, and this is still ongoing actually, a whole series of publications coming out of the study, starting very quickly after the study was launched. Now that's important because it gives nice feedback to participants themselves that their involvement in a study is useful. And of course, for the sponsor, it's very valuable to be able to get publications out rapidly for the range of usages that they've got for them. So hopefully that makes some sense. Okay, so just conscious of time, we're doing quite well on time. And again, as we said before, any questions, please do pop them in the chat box. So with that, I'm going to pass back over to Catherine, and she's going to take you through our first session.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks. So you should now be able to see my slides. I'm relying on colleagues to tell me that they can see them. Fantastic. Great, so I'm going to spend the next half an hour or so telling you about the role of patient-centered outcomes and our patient-centered outcomes teams in our real-world app-based studies. What do we mean by patient-centered outcomes, and what's the role of our team? So much of our data collection, as you've probably gathered by now, is centered around how patients think and how they feel. And by nature of patients telling us this through the data collection platforms that we use and through the questions that we ask them, that data is collected without interpretation from healthcare professionals or other external experts. We want to know about this data, this subjective data, directly from the patients themselves. And it's the role of our patient-centered outcomes team to develop a patient-centered outcomes strategy for each of our projects. And that involves thinking about, first of all, what data do we want to collect? So what data is important to patients, to our sponsors, to key stakeholders, and also how is that data best collected? So best collected from the point of view of the patient, from their experience, but also in terms of the study design and the practicalities associated with that. So that's what our patient-centered outcomes team do on a day-to-day basis. So our studies collect data both from patients and also from those around them, such as caregivers, to describe typically the burden of disease and or the impact of a particular treatment or intervention. And the objective of the studies can be quite different. So some of our studies are very much focused on burden, not linked to particular treatments, whereas some of our other studies are very much focused on the impact of our sponsors' treatment or to competitors' treatments, for example. And it's the role of our patient-centered outcomes team to really balance up the data, the collection of data that matters to patients with the data that's of value to stakeholders. And as you may have gathered already from what I've said, that's not always an easy thing to do. So what do we mean by app-based study? What do we mean by our data collection platform? Well, these are some screenshots from publicly available projects that we're working on. And they're probably quite different from what you've typically seen with regards to patient-reported data collection. So usually if a real-world study involves a patient-reported aspect, this might be collected via an online survey, for example, a web-based survey, or even an ECRF type of approach. And these tend to be quite uniform, quite basic, not necessarily as an interactive patient experience as what you can see on the screen here. And that's one of the things that we do differently. So our apps are designed for patients to be able to input data to them in real time in whatever setting they want. So it could be that they're sat on their sofa at home, TV on in the background, completing questionnaires for us, entering data, telling us about their changes in their medication. It could be that they're sitting on the bus, probably not so much at the moment, but sitting on a form of public transport, and using that as an opportunity to catch up on their data entry. So our platform and our apps are designed to be as flexible as possible and to remove much of that clinical influence from data collection, and for patients to be able to really express how they're thinking and how they're feeling in the comfort of their own homes or wherever they choose. And as you can imagine, the design of these apps is really key to engaging that patient population over time. Just to give you a little bit more detail, these are some screenshots from a study that we are currently conducting in melanoma. And it just gives you a little flavour of the types of visuals that the patients can see on the screen in front of them. So in the first screen here, you can see the home screen that the patient lands on when they come into the app. It's providing the notifications, it's reminding them of the data that they need to input today. It's telling them about some of the programs, incentive programs that we've got going on at the moment. It might be updating them on news and information in the study, providing them with some of the key data that's coming out of it. On the second screen, you can see what we call our tracker. So this is where the data that we are asking patients to enter is broken down into components to make it easier for them to go in and to enter that data. So rather than just seeing survey after survey after survey, question, we break it down into stages for them to make it more manageable. On the third screen, you can see an example of how patients could enter their treatment. Again, this is done very differently for different studies, but you can see here that patients are able to view the treatment data that they have entered. So they're able to look at both the names of the treatments that they've put in, but also start and stop dates, durations of treatment is calculated and presented to them. And so they can go in and edit that at any time as it changes. So that's what our platform looks like, and what our apps typically look like. And in terms of the actual data that we collect, well, that's also hugely varied. We collect things that are probably a little bit broader than the typical patient-reported outcomes that you would expect. So a lot of our studies are focused around these things like quality of life, symptoms and impact. But one of the advantages of using this flexible platform is that we're able to collect a lot of different additional types of data to those that you would typically see in clinical trials or in more formal observational studies to describe the impact of living with a disease. So it could be, for example, things around adverse events. So capturing adverse events in the patient's home. We know that adverse events don't necessarily happen when the patient is sat in front of that clinician. Actually, a lot of those adverse events are happening to patients behind closed doors, and through our app they're able to report those in real time without that clinical influence. Also things like satisfaction with medication, adherence data, things that are usually more often than not particularly sensitive data to collect. And again, the influence of a clinical team, sitting next to a research nurse, for example, or knowing that you have 5 minutes to complete a questionnaire after an appointment, can often influence how truthful patients are in these areas of data capture. And often this can be overcome by removing that clinical influence, and patients have told us they feel more comfortable with sitting in their own homes entering this data. So we often see these types of data appearing in our studies as well. We also collect data on caregiver burden. So in the same way that your patient can collect this data outside of a clinical setting, if they have caregivers, people looking after them, even family members that they live with, whatever that population of interest looks like, we can also collect data directly from them. We can link that data. So we might have a section in an app for a patient, we might have a section in an app for a carer. They would each download that app, and then we can link those data sets. And actually, often they enjoy completing that together. There are also some other advantages to our app-based platform in terms of things like collecting healthcare resource use data. So we know that there are a number of different ways that this can be collected, and one of those which comes with advantages and disadvantages is the collection of healthcare resource use data directly from patients themselves. As you can imagine, patients often find it very difficult to remember what scan they had on a particular day, what healthcare professional they saw. But if they're able to sit at home with those appointment letters in front of them, it can make that data entry a lot easier for them. The same goes for hidden patient reported costs. So typically, if you're conducting these types of real-world study, you might ask a patient to look back over the last month or sometimes even further and ask them how much they spent out of their own pockets in managing a disease. You can imagine that that is very difficult for patients to provide those accurate figures, but if they're able to take their phone from their pocket, open the app whilst they're stood in front of that parking meter in the hospital and tell us how much they've paid for that parking, that data is going to be a lot more reliable than trying to recall that several days or weeks later. As well as all of the typical patient-reported outcomes, we can also use our app to collect clinical data, treatment data, as you've seen, lifestyle data, and also basic demographic data about patients. So in the learning objectives, I also talked about touching on the differences between a patient registry and a registry-based study. And this is really topical at the moment. So the EMA have recently, last month, produced or released some draft guidance on the differences, the similarities and differences between these two approaches to a project. The consultation is open until the end of the year. We're really looking forward to contributing to it. These are the types of discussions that we have with sponsors and also with potential sponsors on a day-to-day basis. And it's often one of the first questions and discussion points that we have with people who are interested in conducting this type of study. So patient registries and registry-based studies, what are the similarities and differences? Well, the first thing we need to think about is the definition of those. It's really important up front to define which one of these you are aiming to do in your project. Registry-based studies are typically driven by research objectives or hypotheses. So these research objectives or hypotheses are then investigated using data from either an existing patient registry or, often in our case, the setting up of a new registry. On the other hand, patient registries usually involve the data collection from a specific group of people. The data set tends to be a lot broader, and then these registries are used later down the line to conduct specific research questions. And we're very used to running both types of projects, so patient registries or registry-based studies. We've got a number of each ongoing at the moment. The timelines for these two types of projects can often differ as well. So the study timelines for registry-based studies are usually driven by the collection, extraction, analysis of the data set that's relevant to those study objectives, whereas the registries tend to involve data collection over a much longer term, routine data collection driven by the schedules for analysis. In terms of patient population and enrolment, there can also be some differences there. So in registry-based studies, the population enrolled is defined by the study objectives. It tends to be a subset of the population, or all of the population being all of the people with that disease in a particular geographic area. And it's also important to consider the generalizability of your study and your study results to that broader patient population. On the other hand, a patient registry tends to involve a broader population, often complete enrolment of a patient group. So you would tend to see very few exclusion criteria, and very few inclusion criteria. Often you would restrict it to something like adult patients living in a particular geographic location, and that way you're looking to capture the whole of that disease population within your registry. The actual data set and the data collection processes also tend to vary. Within a registry-based study, your data collection is very much restricted to what's required by those research questions, with the addition of some confounders perhaps, or some demographic data to describe the population. Whereas in a patient registry, the data set tends to be wider, depending on the purpose, but you tend to agree a sort of core set of data that's important. And then there can be a lot of other interesting complementary data points around that. As you can imagine, the analysis plans tend to look very different for these two types of projects. So the analysis plan for a study, a registry-based study, tends to be very hypothesis-driven. You'd usually expect to see a separate statistical analysis plan, whereas for a registry, you may also see a separate statistical analysis plan in some cases, but actually those analyses are often performed repeatedly at pre-agreed intervals. And then finally, quality control of the data. So you would expect to see some level of quality control in the data for both types of projects. It's certainly what we would recommend. But for registry-based studies that are hypothesis-driven, there usually tends to be some additional quality assurance on the data collected, and it tends to be predefined. Whereas typically for a registry, a lot of that quality control and quality assurance can be built into the system and automated. So there's some of the main differences that we see, and some of the typical types of questions and conversations that we have with sponsors during the design of a study, and when we start to think about what that data acquisition strategy is going to look like. So not going to spend too long on this, but I'm just going to touch on some of the areas where the evidence generated by our studies is used. So why do people come to us? Why do people work with us? For a number of reasons. Our data is used in a number of ways. It can roughly be split into pre-marketing authorization and post, but we've said post-marketing authorization and beyond because the possibilities really are endless. So typically in the area of pre-marketing authorization, our study data is used to provide information on standard of care, current burden of disease, describing the current patient population. And often sponsors will come to us with the aim to contextualize the results of their trials in a real world broader population. On the other hand, in the post-marketing authorization space, our data is used for a huge variety of reasons and purposes. Our platforms are used to provide a data collection tool for typical non-interventional studies. As you can imagine, the quick setup of our studies compared to other typical real-world studies lends itself very well to things like post-authorization efficacy or safety studies, where there's a mandated data set to collect from a group of patients. And we've said here, answering specific research questions to support the value of the product. And that really is extremely broad, but it's the type of things that sponsors come and discuss with us. They said, we know that our product has this particular value. We want to be able to show that, and that's currently missing from the evidence that we have. We know that we need to venture into a real world setting to be able to collect that, and actually that data needs to come from patients themselves. So our studies are often commissioned to address those types of gaps as well. And also important to mention is to provide valuable data to patients and patient groups. So we work in close collaboration with patients and patient groups. And it's really important to make sure that when we're designing these studies and we're running these studies in collaboration, that we're considering how that data is going to be fed back to those groups, how it's going to benefit them, and how it's going to be used. So I want to spend the next few minutes talking about some of the challenges of working in the patient-centered outcomes field in this particular setting. It's what we do is quite different. It's certainly quite different from thinking about the role of a typical patient-centered outcome scientist, and certainly different from a lot of the work that I have conducted previously. And so since I started at Vitaccess, these are some of the challenges that I've identified on a day-to-day basis, and some of the things that I work through with my colleagues as part of my role. So the first challenge that I've identified is the lack of proportionate guidelines and standards. So there are a number of guidelines and standard checklists that have been developed to help those of us working in the patient-centered outcome field to select appropriate patient-reported outcome measures, to develop those and to validate them to high and rigorous standards, how to incorporate those into clinical trial protocols, how to analyze those and report that data. But a lot of the guidelines and some of those that you see here on the screen, so for example, those from the FDA, EMA, Spirit Pro, CSAQL, Consort, these are all names that my patient-centered outcomes colleagues throw around and talk about on a day-to-day basis when they're working in the area of interventional studies. But a lot of these guidelines have been very much evidence-based and have been developed using the absolute highest gold standards. And often, to be able to provide this level of evidence that's needed to meet these standards and these guidelines involves a lot of additional time and money from the study that the primary study that you're conducting. So, as an example, a sponsor may need to commission a separate study to provide the level of evidence that's needed to prove that a patient-reported outcome measure or questionnaire is valid in their target population. Or they might need to provide some additional, for example, cognitive debriefing work to show that a particular questionnaire or instrument that they've selected for use is understood and interpreted by their patient group as they would intend. And these often involve whole separate studies, a lot of extra time, a lot of extra money to provide this evidence that is quite rightly required. However, in the real world setting, our timelines tend to be shorter, our budgets tend to be smaller, and so we can't always provide this level of evidence. And importantly, it's not always needed. So it's always a balancing act for us to make sure that we're following gold standard processes as far as we can, but also making sure that they're proportionate to the rest of the work that we're doing, and knowing those areas that we need to follow exactly and those areas where we can be a little bit more flexible. So that's the first challenge that I've encountered. The second challenge is thinking about the conversion from paper to electronic format in a bring your own device setting. So I talked about people being able to complete these studies and enter the data in their own homes. And what's particularly important in thinking about that type of design is that somebody is able to complete our studies and enter the data not depending on the type of device that they want to use. So if they've got a phone with a very small screen, or if they want to enter their data using a large tablet, for example, they should be able to do that on their own device. And that's what we mean by bring your own device. So bring what you have already. The study, the application will work on that. And typically when you're working in a patient-reported setting, either in real-world studies or in clinical trials, when you're thinking about the conversion of paper questionnaires, so a lot of questionnaires are historically developed on paper and need to be converted to an electronic setting, you need to work quite closely with the instrument developers and licensors, so the people who have developed these questionnaires, the people who hold the rights, the copyright to them. And that process typically involves that license holder reviewing your screens, so actually looking at how you've programmed those questions to make sure that they are happy with them and that they're being presented to the patient in the way that they're intended. And typically when we started out doing these studies, we would go to these instrument developers and say, we're ready for you to review our screens, and could you give us the guidelines for programming these? And they would say, well, what size screen are you using? And we would say, well, all sizes. We're using 10, 20 different screen sizes. Which ones do you want to see? And so that can be a real challenge for us to think about. And sometimes we have had to agree perhaps them reviewing a percentage of the different types of device or different types of configurations that we might use, rather than reviewing them all. So as you can imagine, it's not as simple as providing a paper survey to a patient or even to providing a standard programmed web survey. So the third challenge that I've experienced in working in this type of environment is balancing the measurement science principles with the user experience design and the patient engagement in this type of study. And I touched on this when I was thinking early on. So measurement science is the principles that underline patient-centered outcomes and the collection of data directly from patients. So how that data is collected, how it's analysed, how it's used, how it's interpreted. And there are a lot of rigorous guidelines and research that has gone into defining these gold standard processes. And it's up to people like me and the people in my team to make sure that these guidelines are being followed as much as possible. Now, over in John's team, he will come to talk about this a little bit more, we have people who are very different to me in their backgrounds, user experience designers, so creative, brilliant people who are know how to display things and format my slides for me, etc. But it's their job to make sure that the patient experience in our app is optimal. So it's as easy as possible for a patient to access our app and to enter that data. So they will often, when I go to them with my recommendations from the protocol to say, these are the questionnaires that we would like to use, this is what we recommend, they will then look at how these questionnaires are programmed and faced to that patient. And often they'll come back to me with changes that they want to make. So they'll say, well, this question's really long-winded. You know, we can break this down. We can remove a question stem. We can change the wording. This is going to make it a lot more accessible to this particular patient group. And often I have to then go back and explain to them that actually we can't make changes to this questionnaire. It's a questionnaire that's been developed for these reasons. It's been validated with this particular wording in mind. And an instrument licensor, quite rightly, will say, no, you can't make these changes. It may then impact the validity and reliability of your data. So working with people like that in the team can sometimes be challenging, balancing the creativity with the science side of it. But it's one of the things about our setup that's really unique. You know, we offer the science-based pieces of a study, and we also offer the creative pieces. And so one of the challenges of applying that science in this type of setting is making sure that the patient experience is really optimal. Trusting my colleagues to do that. You know, they do that in a lot better way than I do, but it's my job to make sure that that data is still collected in an as valid and reliable way as possible. If the patient experience is better, the retention in a study is better, the missing data is reduced, and patients are less likely to be frustrated with the process for entering that data. Okay, my fourth challenge that I've identified with working in this setting. So one of the challenges that we've encountered is how to combine validated patient-reported outcome measures, so legacy questionnaires that have been developed and often used for years, with bespoke questions in our app. So a nice example of this that has come up a number of times recently in projects that we've been working on is the collection of data around work and work productivity. So you may be able to see on the screen here, the writing might be a bit small, a screenshot of a question from a patient-reported outcome measure called the WPAI, so the Work Productivity and Activity Impairment Questionnaire. It's a very widely used questionnaire to provide data on various aspects of work productivity. So it includes things like absenteeism, presenteeism, work productivity loss, and impact on activity or activity impairment. Now, we know that when we talk to patient groups and we're designing our studies, that often these are not the only areas of their working lives that are impacted by suffering from a long-term condition. Actually, there are a lot of other areas that are often impacted. Things like choice of career pathway, changes and adaptations that need to be made at work to enable them to continue working. It might be physical adaptations to their screens or their setup in an office, for example. And we know that this type of data is important. These concepts are important to patients, but they're not always covered by the standard validated patient-reported outcome instruments. And often, particularly in patient registries, where the scope is a lot broader, we talked about the scope of the data set of a patient registry being broader earlier. This is the type of data that our sponsors want to see. So things that are data that's different, data that's not going to be captured as part of a standard clinical trial or a standard real-world study. What are those additional areas of patients' lives that are impacted by living with a particular condition that we can uncover using our registry-based setup? And so we need to think about how to combine these, what we call bespoke questions or bespoke areas, bespoke concepts, with the validated instruments that we know is going to give us the data that's going to be accepted or considered by some of the key stakeholders. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we do that at Vitaccess over the next 10 minutes. So they're the challenges that I've identified of applying patient-centered outcome measurement science in the SAT-based setting. How do we actually go about doing it? What's the role of our patient-centered outcomes team? And how do we get from that blank sheet of paper that our sponsors come to us with to a list of questions and a data set that we're going to collect from that group of patients that's going to be both meaningful to the patients and also meaningful to the sponsor and their stakeholders? So I'm going to talk you through just a couple of examples and a step-by-step process of what we would typically undertake. It is worth saying, of course, that this is very different, tends to vary for each study. So it can't be applied to every single study, but it gives you an idea of the type of process and the type of thoughts and discussions that we're having. So the first one is meaningful collaboration with patients. So this is such a hot topic at the moment. It's all about involving patients in research. It's all about collaborating with patients. What does that actually mean? It means very different things to very different people. Some people are doing it as a token. Some people are saying we need to involve patients in our research to tick a box. How are we going to best do this? So we don't believe in that. We believe in meaningful collaboration, and we've defined what we mean by meaningful collaboration. We have thought about the areas of our studies where we think it's important to collaborate with patients. And sometimes it's not even about collaboration. Sometimes it's about letting the patients or the patient groups lead particular parts of our studies where they are the experts, and us relying on their expertise. So typically, we would collaborate with patients at all project stages, and we don't mean that as a token. You know, this is what we do day in, day out. So our first contact, as I mentioned, is at the start of protocol writing. So when we're having those very early discussions, and it's particularly important at that stage to understand what's important to that group of patients. We work with patient groups to lead on patient recruitment. Also, they're a key part of our scientific advisory boards to decide how the data is used and to make key decisions about any changes in our projects. And they're also consulted at the end of projects about data usage and presentation. So briefly taking you through our approach, I'm aware I don't have very long left, so I'm going to try and do this concisely. What you see here on the screen is not very concise. What you see here is an example of a very basic conceptual model, and this would always be the first step in our patient-centered outcome strategy process. So the first thing that we would do is we would endeavour to understand what concepts are important to patients in a particular disease area. And we would do that through literature reviews and talking directly to patients through interviews or focus groups. And then we would summarize all of those concepts or areas of a patient's life that are affected by living with a particular disease. We would group those visually. And often we would share those back with patient groups and with clinicians to get their input too. So here's an example of one that we have done recently. You can see we've broken it down by symptoms, activities, emotional function, etc. We would then have a look at what are the available measurement tools, what are the instruments, the questionnaires available to be able to capture this data. And we would critique those, and we would critique them based on a number of different factors. And some of those factors are quite standard. So we would look at things like the instrument properties in terms of how they've been developed and validated. But some of those are quite unique to the setting that we work in. So that could be things like the layout and the language that are used. Are they going to be easily adapted to an app-based setting? What about the localization? So Helen will come on to talk about that in our second session next week. But we conduct a localization assessment on these very early. So if we need to translate these into different examples, different language examples, how easy is this going to be able to be done? What we then do is we map the content of these instruments, the concepts that they cover, the concepts that these questionnaires cover, onto the primary research that we've conducted. So an example here, I'm taking you back to the basic conceptual model that I presented earlier. Here you can see in purple, we've mapped our first instrument on there. So we've actually gone through that questionnaire and looked at the concepts that it's covering, and we have noted those on our conceptual model. So you can see that there is maybe a quarter coverage there of our conceptual model, and you can see which areas are covered. If we then combine that with another instrument, if we start to think about using two questionnaires together, you can see here in the orange that the second questionnaire provides us with a more rich data set. It gives us additional areas of concern that are not covered by just that first questionnaire alone. And this is the process that we go through. What comes out of that is a list of recommendations for each study, and this is what it would typically look like. So there would be the name of the patient-reported outcome measure or questionnaire, a brief description of it, and then with patient burden in mind, the number of questions and the estimated completion time in minutes. That gives us an idea of, when we're building those combinations of questionnaires at each time point, how long it will take the patient to complete that. Then developing bespoke questions. So I talked about developing bespoke questions to go alongside these patient-reported outcome questionnaires. So once we've got our list of patient-reported outcome questionnaires that we want to use, we start to think about any additional questions that we want to develop as well. And that's where we work very closely with our editorial team and also with our user experience team to make sure that these questions are developed in a way that's going to be best understood by patients, and also to give us the data that we want. We like these questions to be evidence-based where possible. If other people have already looked into the best way of phrasing these types of questions to address particular topics, we might use some of that learning. Generally, we'd follow the rules for developing items for a patient-reported outcome measure, things like addressing one concept per item, using short, simple sentences, and avoid repeating concepts using slightly different wording. So we would do our best to follow these or apply these principles of patient-centered measurement science when we're developing our own questions as well. And of course, these would be tested with patients further down the line. Okay, the final step in our approach is ratification of our patient-centered outcome strategy. So it's all very well us getting the input from the patients at the start and then doing our own desk research and thinking to recommend patient-reported outcome measures and bespoke questions to sit alongside them. But we would then go back and ratify our approach with a number of key people. First of all, with our scientific advisory board. So we tend to set one up for every project. Typically, patient representatives, patient association representatives, and key opinion leaders or clinicians would sit on these advisory boards, and we would ask them to check that the strategy aligns with the study aims and reflects their expertise and their understanding of either living with or treating patients with that condition. We'd also go to patients themselves, so not just expert patients who are representatives from patient groups, but patients who have been identified from patient associations as being super users, so perhaps those who are particularly interested in this type of research. And then we would usually start with a pilot study with a small group of patients. And again, we would be checking that the strategy reflects the aspects of the condition that they find burdensome, things that they want included and explored. We check that our questions were suitable and the relevance of our response options to their particular healthcare setting or country. And then finally, as Giles will share with you shortly, we also go out to payers to test that the strategy that we're developing meets HTA or other key stakeholder requirements. So that's the end of my presentation. I hope that's taken you through a daily life of a patient-centered outcome scientist at Vitaccess, and giving you a little flavour into how we come up with the data set and the data acquisition strategy for each of our projects. So thank you very much.
Or in what disease they have, where they live, for example. We need to think about inclusion and exclusion for anyone trying to access and participate in the study. And another thing that Microsoft have said is that we can think about that in terms of designing or creating solutions for one that extend to many. So everyone has abilities and limits to those abilities. Designing for people with permanent disabilities actually results in designs that benefit people universally. So in their terminology, constraints are a beautiful thing. And actually we can learn a lot from the diversity that's around us in the population. Around 15% of people worldwide experience a disability that affects their internet use. So given that, I'm going to just put up the next slide and ask everybody to consider those two statements. Effectively, when we think about inclusive design, we're thinking about good design. So it doesn't mean to say that by designing something in an inclusive way, it's any less good design. In fact, I would argue it's even better design. And the other statement is always be thinking about who are we leaving out? Who could we be leaving in a position where they can't join this study and they would like to? They've got really good input, they've got great data to contribute. Who could we be leaving out? So let's think about research. Now, setting up an engaged group of relevant potential participants is a really key and essential part of co-creation in these studies. At Vitaccess, we've actually created our own internal unit devoted to that activity, and those are people that manage both professional and lay patients, plus some volunteers who have no specific conditions. And from those groups of people, we can start to create personas, which are essentially hypothetical archetypes of actual users. It means that you can combine the representations and needs and desires and pain points of groups of people who share some common traits into these personas. And they're really useful. They help inform our user journeys throughout the app. User experience design, as Catherine mentioned before, is all about thinking of the best ways for the user to interact with the app. And so thinking about user journeys and personas really helps in that. We know that we've got great diversity within our own company. We recognise there could be some shortcomings there, so that's the very reason we work with these groups to make sure we can address those shortcomings. We can do things like checking that the PROs are relevant to the group. So again, things that Catherine was just mentioning, we can test those with that test group and see what their feedback is about those. But also important to remember that feedback's not a once only thing. The whole concept of agile software development, for example, is around inspection, iterating, creating learnings and feeding that back into the design and the development to go back through that iteration and that loop again. One of the other ways that we get this type of feedback and it's worked really well for us in the past actually is in-person patient events. Of course, we can't do that so much at the moment, but equally conference calls work just fine. We've had patient advocacy group events and actually something else that's really helpful is screen recordings of real users using the app. So you can even put people in a studio or you can use some special equipment or just use screen recording to see how people actually interact with the app and what things they might get confused about. So also to understand what things we know about the cohort. So for example, we know that age affects understanding of text and especially if children are involved. There's a statistic in the UK that 6.3 million people, or around 10% of the UK population, have dyslexia. And we know that 1 in 6 adults has a similar reading level achieved by an average 11-year-old. So, naturally in these studies we might use medical terms, but we should keep those understandable, or as Einstein would say, everything should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. So we also know it's important to get localization experts involved to avoid a kind of Anglo-American bias. In Vitaccess, we have linguistic validation experts, and they call that a translatability assessment. So there's many examples you're probably familiar with where global brands have created names that are accidentally offensive or confusing in another language. We might want to brand or name the app a certain thing, so we need to think about that. But also we should avoid idiomatic phrases that both to aid translatability when we're going into other languages. As we've said, these studies are usually multi-country studies, but also just to aid those who are non-native speakers reading it in the country where they are. So more to come on this in a later session on localization from my colleague Helen Williams. Examples that may be of interest that we've found in the past. We've worked with a group where use of limbs was relevant. So patients who had a neuropathy that affected their control of their hands and feet. For their hands, that made scrolling and fine motor control really difficult. So we had to pay attention carefully to how that might affect their use of the app. Tiredness. Now we've worked with a group of patients who have an autoimmune condition that makes their muscles weak and causes tiredness. They can't sit for long periods carrying out surveys. And the other manifestation of their muscle weakness was that they experience drooping eyelids, and that affects their vision, particularly when they're looking up and down, as you might do when you're scrolling, rather than the left to right motion when you're reading. And that's really relevant when we think about things like slider controls, perhaps on PRO instruments and other surveys, that it might be better to use ones that are left to right rather than up to down. We've got experience recently of working with those who experience migraine. Now, for some of those folks, depending on how serious that gets, they can't look at any type of screen, be that device, TV, whatever else. They can't look at a screen for days at a time. So they certainly won't be using one to report their symptoms at the time. So we need to think about how we work around that in the app and how we might be able to still capture some of those things, but maybe afterwards, or how we work with them on that. And again, working with patient groups is a really good way to find out some useful workarounds for those. Actually, even having a device or access to the internet can be a barrier for some participants in studies. Again, we need to check with typical users what the age groups and socioeconomic groups might be that we're dealing with. So moving on to accessibility standards and resources, the WCAG 2.0 and above is now the latest standard that we would recommend working with, and that you would want to go for at least AA conformance in this standard. AAA where possible, actually, but certainly AA is a minimum. And the type of sites that you might be used to seeing that conform very well to this actually would be one of the UK government sites. So if you go to gov.uk, it's a very good example of that AAA standard in action. You can see there's very high contrast ratios. The text is in fonts that are very simple to understand without many serifs, for example, and easy to read, and work well with screen reader technology or other assistive devices. And as I've mentioned before, Microsoft's done some really leading work on inclusive design principles. There's a link there that might be of interest. And Google too have considered accessibility a lot throughout their material design principles, which you now see throughout most of the Google suite of applications. But I also mentioned in the intro earlier, what about non-conformance to these things? So I've advised, working with them, but what's actually the downside to not doing that? Well, there are recent legal cases that show the problems here. Domino's Pizza, you might be aware of in the US, lost a legal case in early 2019 in which a blind man was unable to make use of discount vouchers and complete a purchase using their Pizza Builder app. So that can definitely happen. And earlier example back in 2012, the National Association of the Deaf argued that Netflix denied deaf users equal enjoyment and access to its site by limiting closed captioning to just a few movie selections. In the US, which is a common market to be working in, the Americans with Disabilities Act is the relevant legislation there, and that was amended in 2008 with the internet in mind, but it is still quite behind the curve and actually is undergoing some more updates at the moment. The problem is the ADA doesn't explicitly address online compliance, and it usually ends up falling to the courts to determine how ADA standards apply to websites or whether they do at all. So I guess in the context of carrot and stick motivators here, those are some of the sticks. the carrots, well, if the carrot of doing the right thing was not enough here, it's also worth saying that Google and other search engines rank sites quite a lot higher if they conform to AAA or AA standards, and they're well aware of those standards. And as they crawl the internet looking for landing pages where patients may find out about these things, if they're not conforming to the standards, those won't do well in SEO. So just have a look at some accessibility considerations. And I think we'd argue that far from being something that's added, accessibility is actually something we need to ensure isn't removed. So assistive technology, the use of screen readers should be included in the testing right up at the front, as it were. So we need to be thinking about this from the word go, and make sure that things we do don't actually detract from accessibility. There's some automated continuous integration techniques that can be useful for adding in tests against assistive technology, and Mark mentioned earlier about user acceptance testing. Really, the most important thing is about asking real users how they get on, and there's really no substitute for doing that. Something Microsoft talk about is the beauty of constraints, as I mentioned earlier, and solving for one and extending to many. So what do we mean by that? Well, let's look at the diagram here, and we can see this illustrates what are called persona spectrums, and we can consider how the same issue affects different people at different times or stages of their life or the situation they find themselves in. You can see across the top, some things might affect people on a permanent basis, some temporary, and some just situational based on where they find themselves at that time. Now, go through a few examples here. Let's think we're designing something for someone who's hard of hearing. So maybe it has audio content included, maybe there's a video playing or something like that. We need to think about ways to accommodate those folks who are hard of hearing, maybe have no hearing at all, by usage of subtitles, for example. But hang on, that's benefited the folks who are deaf, but actually that's benefited the guy in the middle who's in a temporary situation of having an ear infection. He just can't hear for some period of time. Hopefully that will be temporary, but it's helped him too. But it's even helped the guy on the right there who's a bartender. He just finds himself working in a noisy environment. Now, whether or not he's going to be using our app while he's serving drinks at the bar, maybe not, but actually you can think of a number of situations where people could find themselves on a bus going to work, or just in the office, and they don't want audio playing at the time. So having subtitling is obviously really helpful, even to people who have no hearing problem whatsoever. Let's take another example, the one there about touch. So we've got somebody who's permanently lost the use of their arm. So they need one-handed access to all screens, and we all know it can be quite fiddly actually accessing the whole of the screen, especially on devices have got a lot bigger these days. Trying to work your way across the screen is sometimes tricky. So let's design it for that person, but also we've helped out the person who's broken their arm. Now that's temporary. Again, hopefully they'll get better. But if we want them to participate in our study, maybe they've got a broken arm for some 6 to 8 weeks. We don't want to lose them for that period of time, so we've helped that person as well. But as anybody knows who's recently had a child, carrying a baby is a situation where you may lose the use of your arm on and off for some number of weeks or months. So that's the situational benefit you get from that. Other people might be walking a dog, for example, and want to do something on their app while they're out and about. They've only got one arm because they've got the lead in the other arm. So I think it's pretty clear pretty quickly the number of times we can see that designing something in a thoughtful way actually helps many people. Now, another way of looking at accessibility considerations is what's called the behavioural approach. So that helps to create solutions for when there's a risk of a negative outcome that's been identified. Now, what we try to do is to map those vulnerability behaviours we talk about them as onto the personas that we've developed and the user journeys, and then we try to think about risks of negative outcomes. And we can sometimes mitigate these risks by the use of an inclusion principle. So let me just talk quickly through the example on screen here. There's a couple of vulnerabilities over on the left, and that can include things like dyslexia, which I mentioned earlier, or attention deficit disorder like ADHD. And again, the behavior that might be exhibited by people could be information processing issues, or there could be concentration issues. But actually, either one of those things can result in the same interaction, or actually lack of interaction, which is they don't engage with the correspondence. Maybe they don't engage with things we've sent them, or the result says they might miss a notification, an in-app notification on the screen. Therefore, there's incomplete surveys going on. They don't get called back to a survey that they've left halfway through. And that's the result of not thinking carefully about what inclusion principles we could have put in place to prevent that that flow from happening. So that was the part on inclusive design. I'm going to move on now to engagement. So there are many ways to encourage engagement in real-world evidence study like the ones we're covering here. The areas of motivation, rewards, payments, gamification is really huge. I mean, there is no chance to do justice to that in the small time we've got, but we're just going to try and touch on some of the key points, just so that's thoughts that you can go away with and maybe find out a little more. And there was a bit on further reading later on. I want to just mention before we go further the following concept though, and this is probably one of the most useful things to have in mind to begin with. The difference between extrinsic and intrinsic rewards. So as the slide says, extrinsic, the user performs a behavior because they want the reward, or in some cases to avoid punishment, but we're hopefully not going to have that happen in these kind of situations. Versus the other situation where intrinsic reward, somebody has a sense of satisfaction or personal reward from taking part. So I was going to run a little exercise here. We're running a little bit over time, but if you want to try putting anything into the chat where you can think of an example of where you've been motivated to do something, or actually, if you don't want to make it personal to yourself, reasons why a participant might be motivated to do something and take part in a real-world evidence study, and then think about those reasons. Are they extrinsic or intrinsic? So when you're thinking about those two things, try and identify which one of those types of reward they might be looking for. And while that's going on, I'm going to just highlight a few examples. So there's an example here, participating in a sport. Now, you might participate because it's fun and you enjoy it, or you might take part in order to win a reward or get physically fit. The former is intrinsic reward, the latter is extrinsic. Other examples like learning a new language, maybe you like experiencing new things or you want to better yourself. Or the other reason for learning a new language is because your job requires it and you need to go abroad and use that language soon. So those are two different types, intrinsic versus extrinsic. Things like playing cards because you enjoy the challenge, or playing cards because you want to win money. Exercise because you want to challenge your body, and or exercise because you just want to lose weight, or maybe fit into an outfit for a particular occasion. So those are some examples of both of those things. And next slide moves us on to the concept of gamification. So again, Mark mentioned this earlier, and I want to call out really straight away that gamification is quite a difficult term to use in this context. We're obviously dealing with people who have serious conditions, life-limiting conditions. This gamification just is the usual term used for this type of subject, but if we're dealing with people in these studies, they may not really find it appropriate to talk about gamifying the experience of a study like this. So again, it's another really good example of where talking to the research group, talking to patient advocacy groups and patients, you can get a feel for whether that's going to sit correctly, whether we need to alter our terminology to talk about that in a slightly different way with them. But anyway, there's some basic elements to gamification that need to be there. Otherwise, it just doesn't feel like fun or be understandable and motivating. So it should be fun. It should provide a sense of purpose, have rules, give feedback, and be voluntary. And those sort of things can be quite simple. So even just thinking about onboarding somebody into one of these studies, you can gamify that somewhat into a kind of a mission style experience, things that people can learn about the study, welcoming them to community, watching some videos or animations about it, having options to replay those things and go back later on. You can make that feel like a sort of a mission going into it. Moving on to the next slide, we've got some things here, considerations about rewards and payments. Now, there's a lot here, and actually rewards and payments are pretty powerful tools for engagement. We all know that with great power comes great responsibility, so we need to think carefully about that. And I want to just go through a few of those concerns and considerations. So let's talk about the financial rewards, things we might need to consider there. Do the terms of the payment adhere to sponsors' standard operating procedures? Do we need to ensure the value of payment is in line with sponsors' fair market value rates, and also any country-specific considerations? Now, that's a pretty interesting one. We've had the experience of working across many European countries, and we know that France has, for example, has some pretty significant restrictions on what's possible to do there. It may well rule out or certainly curtail the number of options you have in France and the ways that you might potentially reward people or sort of pay people, incentivize them. You need to ensure the value and terms of payment are considered ethically appropriate. So it's not that they're designed to incentivize somebody necessarily to take part, but it's more provided as a thank you for taking part. There's a principle of fairness that we should recognize. So everything needs to be available to all participants. Let's think back to that earlier example of accessibility and access to discount vouchers for the blind person. Thinking of that example, you know, are there any places where some people couldn't take part on the same level as other people? And you know, just simple things like, do all participants have a bank account where they can cash out the funds if they need to? Or if it's Amazon vouchers, do they have an Amazon account if they need one? Is Amazon even active in their country? Amazon is not actually somewhere where people can so easily use those things in every country in the world. So are there any alternatives? You know, maybe PayPal, for example, but maybe there are some other workarounds as well. It's pretty important to mention those can take quite a lot of manual effort to provide. So do you want to have that sort of manual effort involved as well? Be wary of edge cases. We got feedback recently from a parent taking part in a study which was aimed at children as the actual participants. That parent didn't want to participate in the study with only one of their children until it was possible to participate with both children, because as anybody again with kids knows, you've got to be absolutely fair. And she felt it wouldn't have been fair. It would have caused arguments if they'd have had only one get rewards and not the other. We can think about differing levels of disposable income means that the value of financial rewards is different for different people in different countries. We did a study a while ago in beta thalassemia in the US and UK, and it had some financial rewards. They were fairly small by those standards, relatively. The disease is more common in people descending from North Africa, Middle East, India, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. And we know that if we'd expanded that study to some of those countries, the rewards could have amounted to a pretty large proportion of daily wages. So actually, some countries, it will become a problem if it's considered something like a regular income by participants. The local tax authorities may be interested, and there's income tax considerations for the participants. That and other factors about financial rewards kind of changes the level of risk and bias that can be introduced. We ought to think about what happens if we stop financial rewards. We know from some research and some evidence that participation will fall much more than the removal of non-financial rewards. So we have to be sure that we can keep this going for some period of time. And any payment really can attract unintended consequences. So back in 1970, Richard Titmuss argued monetary compensation for donating blood might reduce the supply of or crowd out donors. And actually further studies have found that very small payments can actually have the effect of reducing the intrinsic motivation we talked about earlier, and the desire for someone to behave altruistically if they feel that the payment is almost too small to really be worthwhile. problem of inducement for gaming the system or doing things only for the payment. So that could mean people rush surveys, fill them out incorrectly. There are some techniques we can use on the front end to try to avoid that happening. And there are some techniques in the data analysis after the event that can control for that as well. But certainly it's pretty useful to try to avoid that happening if possible. So if that's all sounding a bit of a worry and a bit of a concern, what are some alternatives? So in the theme of financial payments, we can consider making charitable donations to a relevant charity. We've had great success in doing this with patient advocacy groups. And my colleague Katie Quinn will talk a little bit more in another session about the effects that can have on engagement. The extra benefit there is that you get an increased feeling of community over the individual payments. Demonstrating that people's contribution is important to research, both initially and ongoing. We found that participants are really interested in research and enjoy updates about it. We call them data nuggets, and we let participants know about them regularly. It's that kind of update that's best done regularly, but not excessively, I would say. Similar to saying thank you, incredibly simple thing to do, but really effective, just saying how well done people have done in that day or week or month and how that's helped the study overall. The more tailored and the more balanced those messages, the better. Welcoming people back who've been away for a while, again, it's positive reinforcement. Even updates to the app and new features, they create real excitement and interest, and it's enjoyable for people not to have everything given to them on day one, but just have some things coming later and to look forward to, like a new survey profile page, a new feature for them. You can implement things like streaks and records and other positive reinforcement techniques. You just need to be a bit careful about any loss of motivation caused by the streak being lost, and particularly think about, would somebody perhaps lose that streak of activity due to treatments or an exacerbation in their condition? So if that happens, that's not very motivating if something in your condition caused that. And some kind of voucher or day off or week off feature might allow them to miss those days if they need to. Again, check in with the research group about that. And if we look at the range of rewards, we can actually look on the slide on the right-hand side. See the ones labeled stuff, which are at the bottom, they're the sort of freebies, discounts, deals, maybe payments, whatever. They're weakest really long term at driving engagement, but they are quite quick to implement. The gaming industry as a whole has found over the many years or decades of development there, other things like power, access and status are much more powerful longer term in engagement and keeping people involved. They cost less in the direct outlay, not financial maybe, but they can take some time to implement and actually just to get the community ready for that type of thing. So the cost benefit ratio is something to consider on that. Just moving on then to the diagram by Dr. Michael Wu. This is his spectrum, and it shows a useful summary of the relative extrinsic, intrinsic motivators that you can see along the top there. And those done with the element of time that I've just mentioned, time both for development, but also for the maturity of the product. Also considerations of the sustainability of different rewards, the implementation effort, but also that thing I mentioned earlier about susceptibility to gaming, for example. And then I'll just finish up by saying there's plenty of further reading on this big subject. One particular place to go if you're interested, you could start with the book called Hooked by Nur. He's a real thought leader in the area of habit forming apps. And introduced the hook model back in 2014. It's been used to great effect in many apps that you'll see, but things like getting people to the gym, in classroom learning for children, reading the news on a daily basis, or that kind of thing. And there's plenty in his book to apply to real-world evidence study apps, but especially relevant, I would say, is the third stage around variable rewards, where he splits it as rewards of the tribe. So those are social rewards fueled by connectedness with other people, such as I mentioned, community donations to charity. Rewards of the hunt, which are search for materials and resources and information, such as things like completing surveys, filling out your tracker, your profile, and then rewards of the self, and that's the search for intrinsic rewards of mastery, competence and completion. And that's things like gaining status, having content upvoted in the app that you've submitted, becoming a moderator or maybe a thought leader in the community. So thanks very much, everybody. And I think I've just about finished the slot around about the right time. So I'm going to hand on to the next speaker.
Okay, hello. So I'm Giles Monnickendam. I'm the Director of HEOR for Vitaccess, and my session is Intelligent Design, Anticipating HTA Evidence Requirements for Effective Study Design. So this is the agenda we'll work through today. Through the session, we have about 25-30 minutes. I'll try and whistle through fairly quickly. So real-world evidence can play a very important role in market access, either through centralized HTA decisions, but also through more dispersed regional and local payer decisions. But the successful application of real-world evidence really depends on first identifying the strengths and weaknesses in the existing evidence base for the disease and the product from the payer's perspective, and taking account of the HTA requirements and preferences in the design of any real-world evidence generation. So today I'm going to walk you through the scope for applying RWE in health technology assessment, and then run through a number of case studies. I have four individual case studies. I will try and whistle through those just to give you an example of the breadth of usage of RWE and HTA. I'll then round up with describing how Vitaccess approaches building HTA needs into study design, and then finally I'll give a specific example of this. So through what I cover today, I'm going to focus quite a lot on examples from NICE health technology assessments for the UK, which do have quite specific requirements as a cost effectiveness HTA. But nevertheless, many of the examples are equally relevant to other geographies and payer types. So this is a diagram I use to really illustrate the role of RW in HTA. So on the right hand side, we have here a pyramid, and there's a base of that which is colored in green. And then there's the elements sitting on top, which are grey. Now the base of this is what I would call the consensus evidence base, and that's on burden of disease natural history, and the current treatment paradigm. And it's on this that any product that you're bringing to HTA, it's on this that you build your value proposition. And having a clearly developed consensus in these areas is critical to be able to put forward strong arguments for the value of your product with HTA, even if you have very good efficacy in your pivotal trial and other evidence. The challenge is, particularly in rare diseases, that this evidence base is often sparse or weak. Typically these are areas where in the past there has been limited investment or no investment from commercial drug developers. Also, because of the small population sizes, it may be challenging to gather evidence altogether. It's also the case that even in less rare conditions, that new modalities may come along and challenge the existing evidence base. So in particular, if the disease-modifying treatments are coming into a therapy area where previously there were only palliative therapies, a much deeper and stronger understanding of disease natural history may be required to make strong arguments around the value of those products. So that's really the base of the pyramid. But then on top of that, we build, based on trial efficacy, we'll build arguments around real world effectiveness and cost effectiveness. Now, it's important to remember that from your pivotal clinical trial, what you don't have effectiveness. You have efficacy demonstrated within the narrow constraints of the environment of a clinical trial. And depending on the condition, there may be real challenges of bridging that into a real world environment. The generalizability of the trial to the circumstances in the real world may be challenging. So this is where real world evidence is really valuable to link the trial efficacy through to real world patient impact. And there's also an important role where you do have disease modifying treatments. There's an important role in taking efficacy that's typically measured on a short-term basis for regulatory requirements, and then being able to extrapolate that through to the outcomes that are really of interest and of value to a payer. And then finally, there's the second half of that top of the pyramid, which is costs. Now, this is less relevant for health technology assessment agencies that don't look at cost effectiveness. But those that do consider cost effectiveness, and those that also consider budget impact, they need evidence on health system resource utilization and costs for that analysis. And usually evidence from health system resource utilization from a trial, it usually is not considered valid in cost effectiveness analysis due to the peculiar nature, the very specific environment of a clinical trial. So that's the overall scope over which real world evidence can be applied to support value propositions in HTA. So I'm now going to run through a number of case studies. So this case study 1, which revolves around burden of disease. This is a case from a recent NICE appraisal concerning a rare neuromuscular condition, with a new approved treatment just introduced into a treatment landscape of a number of established unlicensed treatments. And the challenge here is that with no licensed treatments in this space currently, there had been little or no investment in developing evidence by commercial drug developers. So a very limited evidence base. The condition is also rare, and it has a heterogeneous, there's a lot of heterogeneity in the patient experience, and there's no commonly accepted severity scales developed for this condition. Now, in the pivotal clinical trial for the new product, only disease-specific health-related quality of life was collected, and there was no existing algorithm available to map that through to a generic and preference-based health-related quality of life measure that could then be used to convert the health-related quality of life measured in the trial through to utility values that could be used in cost-effectiveness modeling. So the company was forced down a non-standard approach to estimate the utilities that they used within their model. And with the non-standard approach, there was a strong focus within the HTA on validating these utility values. But with no prior studies of burden of disease in this condition, and no understanding, no consensus understanding of the experience or health-related quality of life of an average patient, validating the utility values could not be done satisfactorily. As a result of that, the company really couldn't defend the large utility gain that they'd included within their CE model. And this meant that the price point at which they had requested in the appraisal, proposed within the appraisal, is simply not viable from the perspective of the HTA agency. So, this might have been avoided. An alternative outcome might have been possible if in advance it had been identified, the need to collect EQ5D data in the trial had been identified in advance, and if the company had also commissioned what would have been actually a relatively small burden of disease study to establish some benchmarks around health-related quality of life in the general population, and its distribution according to different patient types and characteristics. So my next case study is around understanding treatment patterns, and so this one is it's a recent oncology appraisal for a rare cancer indication. So the appraisal was for a targeted therapy, and it was for a specific genetic mutation where standard of care therapies are ineffective in prolonging survival. There is little or no clinical response to these therapies, although some clinical experts have said there may be some symptomatic benefit. Nevertheless, the company included within its cost effectiveness model comparator costs, which included 3 lines of treatment with standard of care therapies. That might well be considered quite an extreme position. But nevertheless, clinical expert opinion did provide some support for including some amount of active treatment in the comparative arm of the model. As I say, there is some patients may get some symptomatic relief from standard of care. Possibly a small number may achieve clinical response, and others might receive standard of care just until the point at which genetic testing confirms, in fact, they do have the mutation, which means that they would not respond. But unfortunately, none of this was substantiated with any data by the company. So without any firm evidence on treatment patterns, the company wasn't really able to defend its assumption on the comparator costs, and so NICE included costs for best supportive care only. This then had a major impact on the pricing potential of the product. So here, some fairly straightforward real-world evidence gathered on treatment patterns within the UK would have provided the company with a stronger position from which to argue for the inclusion of higher comparator costs. Possibly the position of 3 lines of therapy could not be supported, but at least some amount of active therapy use within the comparator arm. And so my next case study, this is an example where I can afford to be a little bit more specific. There are no confidentiality issues around this case study. So this one is for a condition called neuromyelitis optica spectrum disorder, or NMOSD, and NMOSD it's a disabling neurological disease with some similarities to multiple sclerosis. It's a chronic, incurable, long-term progressive condition. It's also a rare disease with no approved therapies until recently. So it's another example where there isn't a history of drug developers investing in evidence generation. Now, there are 3 recently approved preventative therapies in NMOSD, all coming to market at a similar time, and all targeting quite high price points. Now, the pivotal trials have all demonstrated strong efficacy in terms of the short-term outcome of preventing NMOSD attacks. But the short duration of the trials, most of the trials, so amongst the 3 trials, they're between 6 months to 1 year of follow-up time in the randomized control period. And this short duration of the trials meant they were unable really to pick up any differences in health-related quality of life, because those differences would largely arise from the progression of disability over the long term. So although the treatments are successful in preventing NMOSD attacks, there really isn't a long enough follow-up to see the deterioration in the placebo arm that will be expected with a greater number of attacks over a period of time. So the challenge for the developers of these drugs is really demonstrating how these strong short-term efficacy outcomes can be expected to translate through to improved long-term outcomes, where the real value of these therapies to payers lies. And unfortunately, the evidence base on the natural history of the disease is very thin. So there aren't any studies that have quantified how the frequency and nature of attacks correlates with disease progression. It's clear that disability is a consequence of incomplete recovery from NMOSD attacks. But patients can have frequent attacks with very little progression. So they may have a period of a year where they have 3 or 4 attacks, but they don't see a huge decline in their abilities or increase in disability. However, some patients or the same patient may then have several attacks where they then have quite a substantial progression. And the understanding of why there might be a shift and the understanding of which attacks are going to will cause disability and which will not, there is very little information and evidence around this. So without better data around this, it's very difficult to develop a robust disease model to estimate the long-term impact of the new treatments. We know they can prevent attacks. For some patients, they will entirely stop attacks. But what that means in avoidance of long-term disability really can't be quantified without a greater understanding and a stronger evidence base on the natural history of the disease. So a well-targeted and designed real-world study could have provided the drug developers with a much stronger platform for disease modeling, which then would have placed them in a much stronger position to capture the full value of the treatments in the HTA process. And then my next case study is a slightly more positive one. So this is an example from a few years back, a nice appraisal in acute lymphoblastic leukemia, or ALL. So a hematological oncological condition. Now, inotuzumab was an innovative treatment in relapsed refractory ALL, and it significantly improved the number of patients who were able to get to stem cell therapy, which is a potential cure for the disease. The alternative treatment at the time, standard of care at the time, was chemotherapy, which was a form of chemotherapy known as FLAG-IDA. Now, FLAG-IDA had a very severe toxicity profile, and in contrast, inotuzumab had a much kinder toxicity profile. With FLAG-IDA, patients would receive 2 courses of chemotherapy, and after each course, they would typically need 5 to 10 days in hospital to recover from the regimen. In contrast, the infusion of inotuzumab could be performed in an outpatient setting, and for those patients who experience no subsequent adverse events, there's no real reason for them to need subsequent hospitalization. So within the company's value proposition and in the model used with NICE, the company included a large saving in inpatient days. Now, this was initially rejected by NICE, and the drug was not recommended. Now, what the company was then able to do, the company appealed the decision, and they presented real-world evidence on hospitalizations for both inotuzumab and FLAG-IDA from an early access scheme. used in a number of centres within the UK. So based on that evidence presented to NICE, that evidence was found to be compelling. They showed very clearly that patients receiving inotuzumab were having the treatment in an outpatient setting and were not returning or not being rehospitalized, or the majority were not being rehospitalized. And based on that, the company won its appeal, and inotuzumab is now reimbursed and available to patients. So that's a positive example where a company applied real-world evidence very powerfully in HTA decision making. So I'm now going to talk you through, the Vitaccess approach. So I hope I've given you a taste of the breadth of the application of real-world evidence in HTA and market access across many areas. Generating RWE can be very powerful and important in decision making in HTA. So now I'll talk you through the Vitaccess approach to capturing HTA requirements within study design. So we've got 3 distinct phases to Vitaccess digital studies. We label those discovery, development, and implementation. In reality, there aren't such hard dividing lines between the phases, but these cover 3 quite clearly different modes of activity. And it's in what we call the discovery phase that the high level and traditional design of the study takes place, and that's really in contrast to for a digital study relying on digital apps. That's in contrast to the technological design required for the study and the development of the technology to administer the study. So it's in the discovery phase where we work closely with our clients to explore the overall research objectives and the potential applications of the data that will be generated. Now, it may be the case that generating data for input to HTA process is not the overriding objective of the study. So typically the studies that we conduct will have multiple objectives, but usually it is the case that evidence generation for market access is one of a number of key objectives of the study. So during the discovery phase, we'll identify with the client the scope for the study to contribute to market access, and that will then lead into the recommendations that we make on endpoint strategy and the statistical analysis plan. Now, this will be very much informed by our understanding of the established approaches and HTA requirements and preferences in the relevant disease area, and the amount of time that we will invest in this will very much depend on the complexity of the issues to be addressed and the appetite that our client has for putting resources behind this. But it's always an important step in the discovery process phase. It's discretionary how much effort we invest there, but it's never zero. It's always an important part. So in the development phase or in the discovery phase of our digital studies, we make sure that we understand fully the client's research objectives and the value proposition for any relevant commercial products, or any relevant products that are either currently commercialized or soon to be commercialized. And we bring our existing knowledge and experience of market access to addressing the client's problem. And we'll collaborate, we'll contribute, we'll challenge throughout the discovery and design phase to ensure that the payer perspective is appropriately captured in the design, alongside the requirements of other key stakeholders in the research. Now, there will inevitably be trade-offs to be made, but that's an important discussion that needs to be had with the sponsors. We'll also conduct additional research where this is appropriate and agreed with the client, and that can include targeted literature reviews, reviews of HTA guidelines and decisions, and that may span multiple geographies or several, a large number of geographies or just several priority geographies. It can include organising and facilitating HTA scientific advice and seeking other expert input and organising primary research with payers. So then, if I'll round up with an example, and then I think we move through to a Q&A session. So I'll round up with a specific example for Vitaccess, and this is an example from a recent digital study designed to measure the burden and real-world treatment effectiveness in chronic and episodic migraine. And you know, the work that we've done through the discovery phase has included evaluating the choice between EQ5D 3L and EQ5D 5L, understanding, you know, the trade-off between the increased range and sensitivity you have with the 5L measure versus NICE's current methodological preference for the 3L measure, and understanding, you know, the risks involved in the mapping that would be necessary for the 5L measure if that was employed within the study design, to then translate that through to a 3L for NICE usage. And then it's also included identifying the appropriate disease-specific health-related quality of life measures, you know, particularly those preferred by HTA bodies, those which have got strong currency with HTA bodies as a disease-specific measure. They're readily accepted. They've been used many times in that indication. And there are also robust mapping algorithms available to convert those through to EQ5D. And then finally, we've done work through the discovery phase to also identify complementary metrics around the burden of disease. Now, in particular here within migraine, the way of looking at the disease and assessing the burden of disease is advancing. So first ISA and then PBAC have moved to a much more granular approach to understanding disease burden and evaluating treatment impact. And then we've seen also in very recent HTAs from NICE a similar shift. So instead of simply looking at, you know, the number of monthly migraine days, there's a desire to have data also on frequency of the episodes and measures of severity of those episodes and their duration, and also the background impact of the condition on health-related quality of life and activities of daily living. So moving from a very simple one metric view of the burden of disease and treatment impact to one which is a much more granular. So, you know, we've ensured that thinking has then been adopted in the choice of endpoints and study design within this particular study. And that's really it. I think quite a whistle through, but I think I might have got us roughly back on time.
Yeah, well done, Giles. Back on time. Good thing. Good work. Hi everyone. Hopefully you can see me. And we've got John back here. So we had a little bit of time at the end to go through questions. We haven't had questions in the chat, so I'll probably be able to give you a little bit of time back, which I'm sure will be very welcome. I just want to cover a couple of things then, as we had some discussions with some participants during the sessions. We're very happy to make materials available. So if you would like those, please get in contact with us. Drop us an email, info@vitaccess.com, or first name dot second name, any of us at vitaccess.com. We'll be happy to share any materials. Please let us know. And then a little bit of a trailer for next week, same time, same place, the second session, covering some of those remaining aspects of these digital studies that we haven't had a chance to go through today. In the meantime, as you think about what we've talked about today, if you have any questions or any suggestions for other any material you would like covered in the session next week, do let us know, and we'll see if we can incorporate that. And I think that's pretty much all we had to say. John, Catherine, Giles, anything else I've missed? You should miss something.
Nothing else from me, Mark. Thanks to everyone for joining.
Okay.
Yeah, it's been really good. Thanks very much, everyone.
All right. Well, many thanks everyone for all your time today. Thanks for all of you for joining us. Hopefully that was useful, and we will hopefully speak to you very soon. Goodbye.